Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are talking about an idea that's it's as old as the hills, but it's still relevant in ways that might surprise you.
Hmm, that sounds intriguing.
It really is. So we're going to be talking about anacyclosis.
Anacyclosis.
Yeah, and in a nutshell, it's this idea that civilizations go through predictable cycles of government, almost like seasons of the year.
Okay, I'm listening. Cycles of government, you say. That sounds like it could get pretty, cyclical.
You got it. And our guide for this journey is going to be none other than Polybius, a Greek historian who had a front row seat to the rise of the Roman Republic.
Polybius. Now, he's a fascinating figure, not just some stuffy historian scribbling away in a dusty library. He actually experienced the rise of Roman power firsthand.
Right. Didn't he get caught up in all the turmoil of that era? I seem to remember something about him being a hostage or something.
Exactly. Imagine being a Greek intellectual, a product of that great tradition of philosophy and democracy, captured by the Romans and taken as a hostage to a foreign land. Talk about a unique perspective.
Yeah, no kidding. That's like ripped from the headlines of a historical thriller.
It really is. And what makes Polybius even more interesting is that he didn't just sit there and sulk. He tried to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
He wanted to understand how this seemingly unstoppable force, the Roman Republic, managed to conquer the world, especially the Greeks who considered themselves, well, the intellectual and cultural powerhouse of the ancient world.
Right, right. They kind of had that reputation, didn't they, the Greeks?
Hmm.
So where does this anacyclosis thing come in?
Well, that's the key. Polybius was obsessed with figuring out the patterns of history. He believed that civilizations, like people, have a kind of life cycle, and he argued that governments tend to evolve through specific stages.
A life cycle of civilizations. I like where this is going.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating concept, and what's really intriguing is that this cycle, according to Polybius, always seems to circle back to the beginning.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, you got to tell me more. Walk us through this anacyclosis cycle. How does it all begin?
All right, well, picture this. It all starts with monarchy, ruled by a single king. Classic image of a wise and benevolent ruler.
Right, like a good king, a just king.
Exactly. Maybe even a legendary founder like, Romulus in Roman mythology. But here's the catch. Over time, as power gets passed down through generations, things can start to get a bit messy.
Okay, I can see where this is going. Power corrupts and all that.
You got it. Those descendants of the wise king, they might become power-hungry tyrants, more interested in their own luxury and control than in the well-being of their people. That's the danger Polybius saw.
Yeah, history's full of those stories, right? Leaders who start out with good intentions, but then, let's just say power goes to their heads.
Exactly. And Polybius argued that at that point, a new group emerges on the scene, the aristocracy.
The aristocracy. Okay, so we're talking about the wealthy, the privileged few.
Right, usually composed of wealthy and influential nobles. They come along and they say, hey, we're the best and the brightest. We can do a better job than this tyrant. We'll bring fairness, justice, good governance, all those things that the tyrant has failed to deliver.
So it's like a regime change, but with fancier robes.
Yeah, you could say that. The aristocracy takes over, promising a better way of ruling. And this is where Polybius was really keen on this, over time, even the best intentions can go astray. Human nature being what it is and all that.
I've got a feeling you're about to drop some more wisdom on us. What happens to those well-intentioned aristocrats?
Well, Polybius observed that these aristocrats, even though they might start out wanting to do good, gradually become just as bad as the tyrants they overthrew.
They get corrupted by power, too.
Exactly. They become more interested in protecting their own wealth and privileges, hoarding power, ignoring the needs of the common people. And that's when things start to shift again.
Okay, so the cycle continues. Where do we go from here?
Well, this is where we enter the phase of oligarchy. Rule by the few, and often it's rule for the few. It's like a betrayal of the original promise of a just and equitable society.
Oligarchy. Yeah, I could see how that wouldn't go over well with the masses,
Yeah,
especially after they were promised all those good things like fairness and all.
right. And Polybius saw this as a critical turning point because, as you might guess, the people eventually get fed up. They see that the oligarchs aren't looking out for their interests, and that's when things start to get really interesting. According to Polybius, the natural progression from here is towards democracy.
Democracy, power to the people.
You got it. The masses rise up, they overthrow the oligarchs, and they try to create a system where everyone has a say. Everyone participates in decision-making. Sounds great in theory, right?
It does. So did Polybius think democracy was the answer?
Well, he certainly saw it as a step in the right direction. But being the astute observer that he was, he also noticed a critical flaw in even this seemingly ideal form of government.
A flaw in democracy. Uh-oh. I'm sensing a but coming.
Always a but. Polybius argued that democracies, while noble in their aspirations, are inherently unstable.
Okay, why is that?
He observed that they're vulnerable to manipulation, to the whims of the crowd, and to the rise of those who can sway public opinion for their own gain.
Ah, so even democracy has its Achilles heel.
Unfortunately, yes. And this is where we reach the most chaotic stage of the cycle, according to Polybius. We're talking about ochlocracy, mob rule. Think of it as democracy gone wrong, where the loudest voices, often driven by passion rather than reason, dictate the course of events.
Ochlocracy. That doesn't sound good.
Not good at all. It's a recipe for instability, short-sighted decisions, and ultimately a breakdown of social order.
Sounds like a pretty bleak picture. So what happens next? Does society just collapse into utter chaos?
Well, that's where Polybius gets really fascinating. He argued that this chaotic state of ochlocracy creates the perfect conditions for a strongman to emerge. Someone who promises to restore order, to crush dissent, and to bring back stability no matter the cost.
Wait, isn't that taking us right back to the beginning of the cycle? Back to monarchy.
You got it. Full circle. We're back to monarchy with a new king, a new ruler, who might start with good intentions, but is ultimately susceptible to the same temptations of power as those who came before. And so the cycle begins anew.
Wow, it's like a political merry-go-round that you can't get off. And Polybius actually saw this pattern playing out in the real world, right?
Oh, absolutely. He used the history of various Greek city-states as evidence for his theory, particularly Athens. You know, Athens went through those periods of monarchy, tyranny, aristocracy, and of course its famed democracy, which ultimately declined amidst internal strife and the rise of those demagogues, you know, those charismatic leaders who exploit popular passions for their own gain.
So this whole cycle of anacyclosis, it wasn't just some abstract theory that Polybius cooked up. It was rooted in real historical events. That's fascinating.
Exactly. And that brings us to the really intriguing part. Where does Rome fit into all of this?
Yeah. Did Polybius think that the Romans were on this same cyclical roller coaster?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Welcome back to our deep dive. Before we get to the Romans, let's just quickly recap where we left off.
Right. We were talking about Polybius's theory of anacyclosis, this idea that governments, well, they sort of evolve through a predictable cycle.
Right, like they go through these stages and always end up right back where they started. It's kind of like a, what's the word? A political merry-go-round, I guess you could say.
A political merry-go-round. I like that. And we also talked about how Polybius, he used the history of all these Greek city-states, especially Athens, as evidence for his theory.
Exactly. He saw it happening in the real world and not just some abstract idea. But you know what I find really fascinating is that Polybius was actually living in Rome as a hostage during all this. He was watching the rise of the Roman Republic from, you know, this really unique insider-outsider perspective. It's like he was living in the middle of a historical drama or something.
Totally. So the big question is, did Polybius think Rome was also going to get stuck in this cycle of anacyclosis? That's what I want to know. Did he think they were doomed to repeat the same mistakes as all those other civilizations?
Well, here's where things get really, really interesting. Because you see, Polybius actually believed that Rome had found a way to escape that cycle.
Wait, seriously? He thought they'd cracked the code.
Yeah.
How? What did he see that was so different about the Romans?
Well, he was super impressed by what he called Rome's mixed constitution. He saw it as this brilliant blend of different forms of government.
Like a mix-and-match approach to politics?
Kind of, yeah. He thought they'd taken the best parts of monarchy, aristocracy, and even democracy, and kind of mashed them all together into this new and improved system.
So it's like they took the strengths of each system and used them to balance out the weaknesses of the others.
Exactly. That was the genius of it, according to Polybius. He saw it as a system of built-in checks and balances. Power was distributed, so no one group could, you know, become too dominant.
That's so clever. It's like a political safety net.
Right. And Polybius, he was really, really into this idea. He saw it as a way to prevent the kind of abuses of power that, you know, led to all that cyclical chaos in other civilizations. But did it work?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Did Rome actually manage to escape the fate of all those other civilizations? Did they actually beat the system?
Well, that's a story for our next segment.
All right, so we're back, and we've been on this wild ride through history. with Polybius and his ideas about how governments change. He thought Rome had it all figured out, but, well, we know the Roman Republic didn't last forever.
Yeah, good old Polybius. He might have been a little too optimistic about the Romans. But you know what I think is really interesting? The fact that his ideas about anacyclosis didn't just disappear, they actually had a pretty big impact on later thinkers.
Really? So even though the Roman Republic eventually went kaput, Polybius's work still had some staying power. Huh.
Oh, yeah, definitely. His writings were rediscovered during the Renaissance, and that was a time when, people were really into classical learning. And guess what? Polybius's ideas were right there in the mix, influencing some pretty big names.
Like who? Any big names I might recognize?
Oh, just this guy named Niccolo Machiavelli.
Machiavelli, the it's better to be feared than loved guy?
The one and only. And yeah, he was super into the whole idea of power dynamics. And,
Yeah.
he drew a lot of inspiration from Polybius. Like, he even came up with his own version of the anacyclosis cycle.
So even Machiavelli, this master of political strategy, thought these old Greek ideas about cycles of government were relevant. Huh. That's pretty wild.
It is. And it shows you how these questions about how societies rise and fall, well, they've been bugging people for centuries.
No kidding. So what about after the Renaissance? Did anyone else pick up on these ideas?
Oh, yeah. Fast forward a few centuries to the Enlightenment, another time of big changes in thinking and politics, and you've got John Adams.
John Adams. Wait, like one of the founding fathers, John Adams?
The very same. He was a huge fan of Polybius. He saw the Roman Republic as like this model for how to create a government that wouldn't, fall apart after a couple generations. And he was really worried about democracies becoming, well, basically turning into mob rule, just like Polybius warned about.
Wow, so John Adams, the guy on the $2 bill, was reading ancient Greek political theory. That's pretty cool.
Right. And get this, a lot of those ideas we take for granted today, like checks and balances, separating powers between different branches of government, that's all inspired by Polybius by way of those Enlightenment thinkers like Adams.
Whoa. So Polybius's ideas about preventing tyranny, they helped shape American democracy. That's mind-blowing.
It really is. And it just goes to show you how these old ideas about power and government can have a huge ripple effect, like through history. But it doesn't even stop there. Even today, people are still talking about Polybius's theory of anacyclosis.
Seriously. But what can a theory from 2,000 years ago tell us about the world today?
Well, some scholars think that the rise of populism and nationalism we're seeing in some places might be a sign that we're heading towards, ochlocracy.
Oh, yikes. So those demagogues that Polybius was so worried about, they might be making a comeback.
It's a real concern. Think about it. In today's world with social media and everyone being constantly connected, it's easier than ever for charismatic leaders to just bypass those traditional institutions. They can go straight to the people, appealing to their emotions, often using fear or anger.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. It really makes you wonder if Polybius was onto something. Like maybe he was tapping into some fundamental truth about human nature and the way power works, even though he was writing thousands of years ago.
I think he definitely was. And while anacyclosis isn't some kind of magic crystal ball that tells us exactly what's going to happen, it does give us a way to think about these patterns in history. And that can help us understand what's happening in the world today, maybe even help us avoid making the same mistakes.
That's a really great point. So it's not about predicting the future. It's about learning from the past,
Yeah.
being aware of the things that can lead to, well, basically the breakdown of democracy.
Exactly. And I think that's the real legacy of Polybius. He reminds us that even the strongest, most successful societies aren't invincible. But he also suggests that, we're not just passive bystanders. We can actually shape our own future by understanding the past, by protecting those things that make a society just and fair.
I love that. It's a message that feels even more important today than ever before. So as we wrap up this deep dive into anacyclosis, I think the key takeaway is history might repeat itself, but it doesn't have to be a perfect rhyme. If we know the patterns, we can make better choices today and maybe, just maybe, create a future where civilizations don't just rise and fall, but they actually thrive.
Well said. And that's the beauty of ideas, isn't it? They can cross time and space, give us new perspectives and push us to be better. So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those conversations going, everyone.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.